Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a fascinating source text that unpacks the Indus Waters Treaty. Now, this is a foundational agreement from way back in the mid-20th century that literally dictates the flow of water for hundreds of millions of people. But right now, it is facing unprecedented scrutiny. Let's explore exactly why.
Treaties are not suicide pacts. Okay, wow. Let's just sit with that highly provocative quote for a second. It perfectly frames the fierce debate our source material is exploring. The idea that a 60-year-old water-sharing agreement is severely cracking under the intense pressure of modern survival. This really sets the stage for a deep dive into the tension between preserving historical diplomacy and meeting some pretty undeniable present-day existential needs. So to really get a handle on the author's argument, we're going to break this explainer down into 5 quick parts. First, how the treaty was born in partition shadow. Then the actual 80-20 water split, the decades of conflict and restraint, the explosion of modern demographics and demand, and finally, the source's case for actual treaty revision. All right, let's kick things off with part 1, born in partition's shadow. We really have to set the historical stage here to understand how this monumental agreement even came to be. According to the text, things moved fast, and they were incredibly turbulent. Just 13 years after the violent partition of 1947, an event that awkwardly and dangerously divided up canals and headworks, Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru and Pakistani President Ayub Khan signed the treaty. The source highlights that the Indian government at the time heavily prioritized finding a peaceful resolution over using water as an immediate political weapon. Now, here's a detail from the material that really stands out. The World Bank actually stepped in to mediate and even fund this highly volatile, localized dispute. It's a striking bit of history. It really reflects a post-colonial emphasis on internationalism and honestly a desperate global desire to avoid regional escalation at absolutely all costs. With that history set, we move right into part 2, the 80-20 water split. How did they actually divide up all this water? Well, when you get into the literal mechanics of the deal, it's pretty staggering. Despite being the upper riparian state, meaning the rivers physically flow through India first, and despite having a significantly larger basin area, India accepted roughly 20% of the waters. That left a massive 80% to flow freely downstream to Pakistan. And to break that down further, the author points out this wasn't just some abstract percentage split. It was a literal, physical partition of specific rivers. India gained control of the eastern rivers, bringing in about 33 million acre-feet of water. But the much larger western rivers, carrying a whopping 135 million acre-feet, were mandated to flow largely unrestricted to Pakistan, with India only allowed incredibly limited non-consumptive use. So, the crucial takeaway the source makes here is that Nehru's idealistic vision of keeping water purely separated from politics required India to make significant long-term concessions. India even funded much of the transition infrastructure for Pakistan. It was an act of profound generosity, but one that critics cited in the text now view as a staggeringly high cost for a developing nation trying to secure its own future. Which naturally brings us to part 3, decades of conflict and restraint. You really have to marvel at the historical restraint demonstrated over the decades. The text emphasizes that the treaty's resilience is almost unparalleled in modern geopolitics. I mean, the water flows continued entirely uninterrupted despite 3 major conventional wars, and despite decades of state-sponsored terror attacks originating from Pakistan-based groups. But, everything has a limit. According to the source, the 2025 Pahalgam attack served as a definitive breaking point. It prompted India to officially place the treaty in abeyance, essentially putting the entire agreement on temporary hold. This was a clear signal that patience had worn out, marking a firm refusal to essentially subsidize open hostility with a steady flow of water. Now let's step away from geopolitics for a second, because the internal realities are shifting just as violently. This is part 4, modern demographics and demand. The source argues that massive internal shifts make a 1960 agreement mathematically unsustainable today. Because the math, it's just wild. The population relying on these exact same critical water resources in India has exploded from around 450 million when the treaty was signed to over 1.4 billion today. The per capita water availability has simply plummeted. And we're not just talking about drinking water here. We are talking about basic food security. The text highlights how falling water tables and overexploited aquifers in agricultural heartlands like Punjab and Haryana directly threaten the ability to grow food for over 1 billion people. Meanwhile, the desert regions of Rajasthan desperately require reliable water diversions that this current treaty framework heavily restricts.
Plus, think about how much the economy itself has fundamentally transformed since 1960. Our modern digital lives require an immense amount of physical water. For example, data center water consumption for cooling, just to keep our apps and AI running, is projected to hit 358 billion liters by 2030. That heavily strains northern tech hubs that absolutely require guaranteed water alongside power for development.
And of course, hanging over all of this is the undeniable elephant in the room: climate change. Erratic monsoons, accelerated glacial melt, and far more frequent droughts add immense urgency to this resource scarcity. The author notes that while this harsh environmental shift puts pressure on both nations, it inherently places a disproportionately heavier burden on India simply due to the massive size of the population it must sustain.
So, tying all these mounting political and environmental pressures together, we hit Part 5, the case for treaty revision. The source material ultimately boils it down to a twofold justification for revising or completely overhauling the treaty. First, the persistent cross-border hostility, based on the idea that a treaty cannot eternally bind one party while the other sponsors attacks. Second, the sheer existential math. A nation of over 1.4 billion simply cannot indefinitely watch 80% of its basin's water flow away while its own farmers, growing cities, and critical industries suffer.
So, what's the proposed fix? The text outlines a very specific path forward. Formally acknowledge the treaty's outdated nature, incorporate modern climate and demographic data into entirely new negotiations, and finally, build the infrastructure needed to harness the water. The core argument here is that prioritizing water for 1.5 billion people is not an act of aggression, but an act of basic, responsible governance.
Which leaves us with a pretty massive question to chew on as we wrap up this explainer. How can a historical 1960 agreement actually survive when the populations it serves have tripled, the climate has definitively shifted, and the geopolitical landscape has fundamentally transformed? It's a profound question about the lifespan of any international treaty facing modern existential realities. Thanks so much for joining me, and keep questioning the world around you.